The morning sun was just beginning to rise over the city when Daniel stepped out of his apartment, coffee mug in hand. He'd lived in the same small building for nearly 15 years, tucked between a bakery and a hardware shop on a quiet street. The walls might have been cracked and the floors a little uneven, but to Daniel it was home. Every corner held a memory. The kitchen table where his daughter did her homework, the narrow hallway where they had measured her height every birthday, the little balcony where he sat at night to think about life. For years, Daniel had paid his rent on time. He never caused trouble, never complained about the broken heater or the squeaky pipes. He respected his neighbors and they respected him. It wasn't much, but it was stable. Something he could count on in a world that often felt unpredictable. After his wife passed away, this place became his anchor. It was the one thing that hadn't changed when everything else did. That's why, when the landlord came by one afternoon with a forced smile and an envelope in his hand, Daniel had no idea that everything was about to turn upside down. The letter was short, printed in formal words that made his stomach twist as he read them. The rent was being raised by 40%, effective in 30 days. And if he couldn't afford it, he'd have to leave. Daniel blinked at the paper in disbelief. "There must be a mistake," he said quietly, looking up at the landlord, a man in his late 50s wearing an expensive suit and a watch that gleamed under the hallway light. "No mistake," the landlord replied. "The neighborhood's changing. Property values going up. I'm upgrading the building and I can't keep charging the same old rate. You've had a good run, but it's time to move on." Daniel tried to explain that he'd been a loyal tenant, that he'd kept the place clean, paid every bill on time, never missed a single payment even when money was tight. But the landlord just shrugged, saying, "It's business, nothing personal." And with that, he turned and left. That night, Daniel sat at his kitchen table long after the sun went down, staring at the notice. His daughter Lily, now grown and working in another city, called him as she did every evening. She could hear the strain in his voice the moment he spoke. "Dad, what's wrong?" she asked. He hesitated, then told her everything. She was quiet for a moment, then said softly, "You've lived there most of my life. He can't just throw you out like that." Daniel sighed. "He can, sweetheart. It's his building. I just rent." He didn't sleep that night. He kept thinking about all the little things he'd lose. The bakery owner who saved him the last loaf every morning. The elderly couple upstairs who always waved from their window. The sounds of the city outside that had become a part of his life. Moving wasn't just about packing boxes. It was about leaving behind the only world he'd known for years. The next morning, he tried to reason with the landlord again, asking if there was any way to keep things as they were. But the man didn't even look up from his phone. "I've got buyers interested," he said flatly. "You've got 30 days, maybe 40 if I'm feeling generous." Daniel walked away feeling helpless. He'd never been one to fight or argue. But this time something inside him stirred, a quiet frustration that came from years of doing everything right and still being pushed aside. He began searching for new apartments. He visited half a dozen places across town, but every landlord he met had the same look in their eyes, a look that measured him not by his character, but by the money in his wallet. Some of the rents were double what he paid. Others required security deposits he simply couldn't afford. At one place, he stood in line with 10 other people, all waiting to view the same tiny room. He left before his turn came, realizing how unfair the world had become for ordinary people. Days passed, then weeks. Daniel's cheerful spirit began to fade. He still went to work, still smiled at his coworkers, but the worry followed him everywhere. The idea of being uprooted after so many years felt like a blow he couldn't recover from. He started to imagine what it would be like to pack everything up. The photos, the furniture, the old armchair that had belonged to his father. Every item carried a story, and he didn't know where those stories would go if he had no place to keep them. One evening, Lily came to visit. She brought food as she always did and tried to lighten the mood, but she could see the worry in her father's eyes. "You always taught me to stand up for myself," she said softly. "Maybe it's time you do the same." He gave a small smile. "And what do you suggest I do? Buy the building?" She laughed at first, but then her expression turned serious. "Why not? You've lived here long enough to know it better than anyone. Maybe there's a way." Daniel shook his head. "I don't have that kind of money, Lily." "Maybe not yet," she replied, "but you've always found a way to make things work." That night, those words stayed with him. He knew buying the building was impossible, or at least that's what logic told him. But the idea planted a seed in his mind. He couldn't shake it off. For the first time since receiving the eviction notice, he began to think beyond the problem. What if there was something he could do? Something bigger than just leaving quietly? As he sat by the window, looking out at the flickering streetlight, he thought about how the city had changed. He'd watched small shops close down, families move away, and expensive new apartments rise in their place. People like him, people who worked hard and asked for little, were slowly being pushed out. Maybe he couldn't stop all that, but maybe, just maybe, he could change his own story. He opened his laptop and began searching for information about property ownership, housing laws, and bank loans. Most of it was confusing, full of words he didn't understand. But he kept reading. The more he learned, the more determined he became. It wasn't about pride or revenge anymore. It was about finding stability, about taking control of the one thing he'd never had control over before: his home. Outside, the night was silent. Inside, for the first time in weeks, Daniel felt something new stirring inside him. Hope. He didn't know how or when or even if it was possible, but one thing was certain: he wasn't going to give up without trying. The days after the eviction notice felt longer than ever. Every morning, Daniel woke up before sunrise and sat quietly in his kitchen, staring at the folded paper on the table. He'd read it so many times that he could almost recite every line. Each word reminded him that soon he might lose the place that meant everything to him. He tried to stay calm and hopeful. Maybe the landlord would change his mind. Maybe something would come through. But deep down, Daniel knew the man wouldn't. The landlord had money and power, and people like Daniel didn't. That was the way the world seemed to work. Still, Daniel refused to give up completely. He began visiting government offices, talking to people who knew about tenant rights. Some were kind and tried to help, but the truth was simple. The landlord wasn't breaking any laws. Raising rent and asking tenants to leave was legal, even if it wasn't fair. After one of these visits, Daniel stopped by a small park nearby. He sat on a bench and watched children play, parents talking, and the city skyline in the distance. He realized how much had changed around him: new buildings, expensive cars, fancy restaurants. The neighborhood was no longer for ordinary people like him. He thought of his late wife and how they used to dream of owning a little house someday, a place that no one could take away. That dream had faded over time, buried under bills and responsibilities. When he returned home that evening, he opened his laptop again. The screen glowed in the dark room as he typed words he never thought he'd search. How to buy an apartment building. First-time buyer loans. Property investment for beginners. He didn't understand half of what he was reading, but he kept going. Something inside him had changed. He wasn't reading just for curiosity anymore. He was reading because he needed to fight back. A few days later, Daniel met his neighbor, Mrs. Green, in the hallway. She was an elderly woman who had lived there even longer than him. She looked worried. "I got one of those notices too," she said quietly. "He's pushing all of us out." Daniel nodded. "He's planning to sell or rebuild, I think." Mrs. Green sighed deeply. "I don't know where I'll go. This is all I have." Her words hit him hard. He wasn't the only one facing this. There were other families, older people, single parents, all of them about to lose their homes. The building wasn't just bricks and walls. It was their lives. That night, as Daniel lay in bed, her words kept echoing in his head. "This is all I have." The next morning, he decided to visit the landlord again, even though he knew it probably wouldn't help. The man greeted him with the same cold politeness as before. Daniel tried to explain that the tenants needed more time, that some of them had nowhere else to go. The landlord barely listened. "It's not personal, Daniel," he said again. "I'm just doing what makes sense financially. You should start packing." Daniel wanted to say something, anything that might change his mind, but the words never came. He left the office feeling smaller than ever. That night, Lily called again. She could hear the frustration in his silence. "You sound tired, Dad," she said softly. "I am," he admitted. "I'm tired of people treating us like we don't matter, like we're just names on paper." "Then stop letting them," she said. "If you can't change his mind, change your own situation." Her voice was calm but full of determination. She reminded him that she believed in him, that he'd always been strong. "You built a life from nothing," she said. You took care of me when things were hardest. You can handle this too." After the call, Daniel sat in the dark for a long time. The city lights glimmered through his window. He thought about how powerless he had felt all his life when it came to money and housing. Maybe it was time to do something different. Maybe it was time to stop accepting things as they were. The next weekend, he went to a free real estate workshop that he'd seen advertised online. He felt out of place among all the younger people in suits taking notes on their tablets. But he listened carefully. He learned about small business loans, housing grants, and how some old buildings were being sold cheaply because their owners were in debt. One speaker mentioned something that made his heart skip a beat. Many landlords overborrow against their property. If they fail to pay back, banks auction the buildings. Daniel wrote that down immediately. When he came home, he searched his landlord's name online. He didn't expect to find much, but to his surprise, there were several public records. One of them showed the landlord's company had multiple unpaid loans. Another mentioned a pending legal dispute with a bank. Daniel leaned back in his chair, stunned. For the first time, he realized the man who seemed untouchable might not be as secure as he appeared. That night, he couldn't sleep. His mind kept spinning with thoughts. What if the landlord really was struggling financially? What if the building went up for sale? Could he really buy it? The idea seemed impossible, almost foolish. But at the same time, something about it felt right. Over the next few weeks, Daniel started gathering information. He talked to a friend from work who used to be in banking, asking about loans and property investments. He contacted the city's housing department and learned about first-time buyer support programs. He even visited the bank to ask if someone like him could ever qualify for a loan. The bank manager looked doubtful at first, but listened to his story. "It's difficult," the manager said, "but not impossible. If you have a stable income, good credit, and a clear plan, you might qualify for certain programs." It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. That small possibility was enough to keep Daniel going. He began saving every bit he could. He stopped eating out, sold a few things he didn't need, and even took on extra hours at work. Slowly, the idea of buying the building started to feel less like a dream and more like a challenge, one that he might actually be able to face. One evening, he walked through the building's old stairwell. The walls were cracked and the paint was peeling. But as he ran his hand along the railing, he saw something more. He saw potential. If this place could be rebuilt, it could become a home for everyone again, not just a pile of rent checks for someone who didn't care. By the time Daniel went to bed that night, his decision was made. He didn't have all the answers yet, and he didn't know how long it would take, but he was done being afraid. The landlord could plan to evict him all he wanted, but Daniel had a new plan now, one that would change everything. Weeks turned into months, and Daniel's life slowly began to revolve around a single goal. Every free moment he had, he spent learning, saving, and planning. It wasn't easy. Between work, bills, and constant worry, some days he wanted to give up. But every time that thought crossed his mind, he remembered Mrs. Green's trembling hands holding her eviction notice and the way she said, "This is all I have." That memory kept him going. He started waking up earlier than usual, spending hours reading about real estate and property ownership before heading to work. At night, he would sit with his notepad writing numbers over and over, possible loan amounts, interest rates, and estimates of how much the building might cost. He was no expert, but he was determined to understand enough to make something happen. Sometimes he'd talk to Lily about his progress. She listened carefully, proud but worried. "Dad, I'm glad you're fighting," she said one evening. "But don't forget to take care of yourself." He smiled, knowing she was right. But deep down, he also knew that this was more than just a fight for a building. It was about dignity. He had been pushed around long enough. One rainy afternoon, Daniel received a call from a man he had met at the real estate workshop. The man worked in property financing and had promised to keep an eye out for any upcoming opportunities. "Hey," the man said, "I thought you'd want to know. Your landlord's building might be going on the market soon. I can't confirm yet, but there's talk about unpaid loans and bank involvement." Daniel's heart raced. He thanked the man and hung up, his hands trembling slightly. For a moment, he couldn't believe what he had just heard. Could it really be happening? Could the building that had caused him so much pain actually become his chance at freedom? That evening, he walked through the hallways of the building, listening to the faint hum of life around him. A baby crying somewhere above, someone cooking down the hall, a TV playing softly in another room. Every sound felt like a reminder of what he was fighting for. This wasn't just about saving himself anymore. It was about protecting everyone who called this place home. Over the next few weeks, Daniel gathered every piece of information he could find. He spoke to the bank again and explained his situation in detail. The loan officer looked at him thoughtfully. "You'd need a business plan," she said. "Something that shows you can manage the property and keep it profitable. But if you can prove that, there might be funding options." Daniel nodded, though he wasn't sure how to create a business plan. That night, he stayed up late watching tutorials online, reading guides, and slowly piecing things together. He listed the current rent prices, repair costs, and what he could charge, while still keeping it affordable for tenants. It took weeks, but eventually he had a plan. Simple but solid. He printed it out, stapled the pages neatly, and brought it to the bank. The same loan officer reviewed it carefully. "It's not perfect," she said, "but it's sincere. You clearly care about this place." After a moment, she added, "Let me see what I can do." Those words gave him a spark of hope. It wasn't a promise, but it was something. He walked home that day with a lighter step, the evening breeze cool against his face. For the first time in a long while, the future didn't seem completely out of reach. Still, there were days when doubt crept in. Some nights, Daniel sat alone, staring at the old photographs of his wife and daughter. He missed the days when life felt simpler, when his biggest worry was just paying the bills on time. Now he was trying to do something far beyond what he ever imagined. He wondered if she would be proud of him, if she'd tell him he was doing the right thing. One Saturday morning, he visited a local credit union that supported small community projects. The manager there listened to his story patiently. "You remind me of my father," the man said. "He lost his home once and never stopped fighting for stability. Let's see if we can make this work for you." Daniel left the office with another stack of papers. More forms, more signatures, more waiting. But this time he didn't feel exhausted by it. Each signature, each conversation, each small step made him feel closer to something real. As weeks passed, whispers about the building's sale grew louder. Tenants started to panic. Some began packing early, afraid of being forced out. Daniel reassured them as best as he could. "Don't lose hope," he told them. "Things might change soon." He didn't explain everything. He didn't want to raise expectations until he was sure. But deep down, he had started to believe that he could actually pull this off. One evening, as he was coming home from work, he saw the landlord standing outside talking to a real estate agent. They were pointing at the building and laughing. The sight burned in his chest, but instead of anger, he felt something else: calm determination. The landlord didn't know it yet, but things were about to shift. Later that week, Daniel got a call from the credit union manager. "Good news," the man said. "You've been approved for a small business loan. It's not enough to buy the building outright, but it's a strong start. If you can find partners or additional support, we'll back you." Daniel could hardly believe it. After he hung up, he sat in silence, trying to process what he had just heard. All those sleepless nights, all those calculations and forms, they had led to this moment. The next step was finding help. He reached out to two close friends he trusted from work. Both had steady incomes and shared his frustration with how unfair housing had become. Over dinner one evening, he told them everything. About the eviction, the research, the possible sale, and his plan to buy the building. They listened carefully. When he finished, one of them leaned back and said, "It's risky, but if there's anyone stubborn enough to make it happen, it's you." The other smiled. "Count me in." Daniel felt his eyes sting with emotion. For the first time, it didn't feel like he was alone in this fight. They spent the next few days pooling resources, going over numbers, and preparing to make an offer if the building officially went up for sale. The landlord had no idea what was coming. To him, Daniel was just another tenant, a quiet man who would soon be gone. But behind the scenes, that quiet man was preparing for something far greater. By the end of that month, Daniel's paperwork was ready, his partners were on board, and his heart was steady. Whatever came next, he knew he was ready to face it. For years, he had been treated like a guest in someone else's world. Now, he was finally ready to build his own. The day the building went up for sale felt strangely quiet. Daniel woke before sunrise, his heart beating faster than usual. He had been waiting for this moment for months, and now it was finally here. The landlord's company had officially listed the property, and offers were being accepted through the bank handling the sale. It was a public process. Anyone with the means could make a bid. He sat at his kitchen table staring at the printed documents spread before him. His hands trembled slightly as he double-checked every page: the loan confirmation, the partnership agreement, the offer letter. Everything he had worked for came down to this one moment. When his two partners arrived, they found him pacing back and forth. "Relax," one of them said with a small laugh. "You've done all the work. Now it's time to see what happens." Daniel smiled nervously. "I just don't want anything to go wrong." They all signed the final documents together. The offer was modest compared to what big developers could afford, but the bank's records showed the property had several issues: old plumbing, code violations, and pending taxes. That made it less attractive to investors looking for quick profits. Daniel was counting on that. Later that afternoon, they drove to the bank's office to submit their offer in person. Daniel wore his best shirt, even though it was slightly faded from years of use. As he handed the folder to the woman at the counter, his palms were damp. She smiled politely and said, "We'll review all offers and contact you once a decision is made." That was it. After months of planning and worrying, all he could do now was wait. The next week felt endless. Every time the phone rang, Daniel's heart jumped. He tried to focus on work, but his mind wandered constantly. He imagined what it would be like to actually own the building, to walk through the halls not as a tenant but as the person responsible for keeping it alive. It was a strange thought, but a good one. Then one evening, it finally happened. He was sitting on the balcony watching the street below when his phone buzzed. He almost didn't answer it, thinking it might be another spam call, but when he saw the number from the bank, he froze. "Hello, this is Daniel speaking." "Good evening," the voice on the other end said. "I'm calling regarding the offer you submitted for the property on Westfield Street. After reviewing all proposals, I'm pleased to inform you that your offer has been accepted." For a second, Daniel couldn't speak. The world around him seemed to blur. "Are you sure?" he finally whispered. "Yes, congratulations. We'll schedule the signing and transfer process within the week." When he hung up, he sat in stunned silence. Then he laughed. A deep, emotional laugh that came from somewhere inside him he hadn't felt in years. The impossible had happened. He called his partners immediately and they shouted in disbelief. "You did it, Daniel. You actually did it." That night, sleep didn't come easily. He lay awake thinking about everything that had led to this moment. The fear, the eviction notice, the endless forms, and the quiet determination that kept him going. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just surviving. He was changing his own story. A few days later, he walked into the same office where he'd once begged the landlord for more time. This time things were different. The landlord was already there, sitting across from the bank's representative. When Daniel entered, the landlord looked up, and for a moment confusion crossed his face. "What are you doing here?" the landlord asked sharply. Daniel took a deep breath and smiled. "I'm here to finalize the purchase," the landlord blinked. "Purchase? You're the buyer?" The bank representative nodded. "Yes, Mr. Carter, this is the new owner." For a long moment, no one spoke. The landlord's confident posture faded. He looked at Daniel like he couldn't believe it. "You?" he said again, shaking his head. "How could you possibly afford this?" Daniel didn't answer the question. He didn't need to. He simply said, "I guess sometimes doing the right thing pays off." The signing took less than an hour, but to Daniel, it felt like the closing of one chapter and the opening of another. When the papers were done and the keys were handed over, he stood outside the building looking up at its worn windows and cracked walls. To most people, it was just another old property. But to him, it was proof that persistence could beat power. Word spread quickly through the tenants. Some didn't believe it at first. Mrs. Green came to his door with tears in her eyes. "You're really the new owner?" she asked softly. Daniel nodded. "We're not going anywhere, Mrs. Green, not this time." The old woman hugged him tightly. "Bless you," she whispered. In the weeks that followed, Daniel threw himself into improving the place. He hired local workers to repair the roof and paint the hallways. He didn't have endless money, but he used what he had wisely. The building began to look alive again, brighter, safer, and full of hope. He called a meeting with all the tenants to explain what would happen next. "I'm not raising anyone's rent," he told them. "We'll fix things slowly, but this building will stay affordable. No one here is being forced out." There was a long silence before the room erupted in applause. People who had been strangers for years began to smile at one another again. For the first time in a long time, the building felt like a community. Sometimes Daniel would stand outside and watch as kids played on the sidewalk and neighbors chatted on the steps. It reminded him of how life used to feel, warm and simple. One afternoon, as he was talking to a contractor, the landlord passed by on the street. Their eyes met for a brief moment. The man gave a tight nod and kept walking. Daniel didn't feel anger or satisfaction, and only peace. He had won, but not in a way that hurt anyone. He had simply reclaimed what should never have been taken away: security, respect, and a sense of belonging. As the sun set behind the rooftops, Daniel leaned against the railing of the balcony that had once been his favorite place to think. The city lights began to flicker, and he smiled to himself. He had gone from being a tenant about to lose his home to becoming the person who could protect others from the same fate. He knew there would still be challenges, repairs, payments, responsibilities. But for the first time, he wasn't afraid. He looked around at the building, the walls that held so many stories, and whispered quietly, "We're home." When the day finally came, the neighborhood looked different. The sun seemed brighter, and even the old building appeared more alive. The man stood quietly in front of it, holding a ring of keys that jingled softly in his hand. For a long time, he just stared at the door that had once been the entrance to his greatest problem, and was now the door to his proudest victory. He couldn't help but smile. After everything, he was now the owner of the place he had once been told to leave. When he stepped inside, memories came rushing back. The narrow hallways, the chipped paint, the squeaky stairs, all of it reminded him of the struggles he had gone through. There were nights when he couldn't sleep, wondering how to keep a roof over his daughter's head. There were mornings when he woke up angry, defeated, and scared. And now every bit of that pain had turned into strength. He touched the wall gently and whispered, "We made it." The first few months as the new owner were not easy. The building needed a lot of repairs, and he wanted to do it right. Instead of hiring people who didn't care, he reached out to the tenants. Some of them had lived there for years. Others were new, but all of them had faced the same fear of losing their home. He told them about his plan to fix the building, to make it better, not just for himself, but for everyone. At first, they couldn't believe him. They had seen too many landlords who only cared about money. But when he replaced the broken heaters in the winter without asking for extra rent, they started to trust him. He didn't just fix walls and floors. He fixed spirits. He painted the halls himself with the help of a few kids from the building, and he paid them a small wage for their time. Laughter echoed through the corridors as paint spilled and jokes flew around. The place slowly started to feel like a home again, not just a building. He made sure every apartment had working plumbing, safe locks, and clean spaces. He even built a small garden behind the building where people could sit together in the evenings. One day, an old woman who had lived there for more than 20 years knocked on his door. She brought a pie as a thank you gift. She told him that for the first time in years, she felt safe and happy living there. Her words almost brought tears to his eyes. That moment reminded him why he had done it all. It wasn't about proving something to his old landlord. It was about giving people the respect they deserved. Soon, word spread in the community about what he had done. Local newspapers picked up the story, calling him the man who turned eviction into empowerment. Reporters asked how he managed to buy the building after being pushed out of it. He always gave the same answer: "When someone tries to take away your home, you can either walk away or stand your ground." I chose to stand. His honesty and humility touched everyone who heard his story. The landlord who once tried to evict him eventually visited. The man didn't hold anger anymore. When they met, the landlord looked uncomfortable, maybe even ashamed. He mumbled something about business decisions and nothing personal. The man simply nodded and said, "I understand. It's all behind us now." He didn't need revenge. He had already won in every way that mattered. As time passed, he began helping others who were going through similar struggles. He learned about housing laws, affordable loan programs, and community support systems. On weekends, he volunteered at a local center, teaching families how to protect their rights as tenants. People started looking up to him as someone who didn't just talk about change but made it happen. His daughter, now a young adult, often reminded him of how far they had come. One evening, while sitting in the small garden, she said, "Dad, you didn't just buy a building, you built a life for all of us." He smiled, his heart full. He thought about the nights they had cried together, the mornings they had woken up uncertain about the future. Every single hardship had led them here. The building slowly became a symbol in the neighborhood. People from other blocks would come by just to see the place and talk to him. They said it gave them hope, that if he could turn his struggle into success, maybe they could too. The man never tried to be a hero. He just wanted fairness, a roof, and a bit of peace, but his actions spoke louder than any speech ever could. Years later, when the city council honored him for his contribution to community development, he didn't wear a suit or give a long speech. He stood on stage, looked at the crowd, and said, "I didn't do anything special. I just refused to give up." The room filled with applause, not because he had money or power, but because he had heart. Back at the building, he often sat on the front steps, watching the lights turn on in the apartments above him. Kids played in the hallway, music drifted from open windows, and laughter filled the air. He felt proud knowing that no one in his building had to live in fear of losing their home again. Sometimes, when new tenants moved in, they were surprised to learn that their landlord lived in the same building as them. He liked it that way. He wanted them to know he wasn't above them, he was one of them. Every month, he still collected rent himself, greeting each tenant with a smile and a small chat about their families. He knew their names, their struggles, and their stories. Life had come full circle. The same man who once felt powerless had become a symbol of strength and kindness. The building that once stood as a reminder of pain now represented hope and unity. Late one evening, as he locked the front door, he looked up at the glowing windows and thought about how far he had come. He remembered the first night after the eviction notice, the fear, the anger, the helplessness, and how it all turned into purpose. He realized that sometimes life pushes people to the edge not to break them, but to make them discover what they're truly capable of. He turned the key, took a deep breath, and whispered to himself, "Home, finally home," and with that he walked inside, surrounded by the warmth of everything he had built. Not just bricks and walls, but a place filled with life, love, and belonging.